Okay, here begins the 7.03 lesson, The End of a Way of Life. And we're going to be talking about Native Americans and how they felt the impact of increasing white settlement in the western half of the United States. As more and more people poured into the Great Plains and into other regions of the West, Native Americans struggled to retain their lands and their way of life. But the U.S. government pursued the policy that had been in effect since the 1830s. Plains Indians and Indians of the Northwest were forced onto reservations to make way for miners, ranchers, and farmers. Despite poverty and hardship, they retained their cultures, but by 1880 a new government policy had taken effect. Goals for this lesson: describe the conflict between Native Americans and the U.S. government in the late 1800s, trace the changing government policy toward Indian tribes between 1865 and 1900, and recognize major differences between popular images of the West and the reality of the Western experience. Okay, make sure you go to lesson resources, you grab your reading guide, or the lesson answer key to follow along as we go through the reading. And we're going to start on page 475. Page 475, The Struggle of Native Americans. In the 19th century, the U.S. government forced thousands of Native Americans off their tribal lands and onto reservations. In the 1830s, the Cherokee and other Indians from the southeast were relocated to an Oklahoma reservation referred to as Indian Territory. Often Indians were sent to lands that were considered undesirable for farming or other uses, such as the arid and remote lands of the Great Plains. Do you remember the forced relocation of the Cherokee from their lands in the southeast to Oklahoma Territory? There was that forced march from the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and that forced march was called the Trail of Tears. But moving on now. In 1851, leaders of various plain tribes gathered at Fort Laramie in what would later be Wyoming. They agreed to accept a federal government proposal that set out specific boundaries for each tribe. They also agreed that in return for an annual payment from the government, they would stay within their new territories and leave settlers and immigrants alone. They were told the land would be theirs forever, safe from the claims of any other tribes or the U.S. government. For a long time, the agreement brought peace to the plains. As long as the Indians remained on land that white settlers and businessmen did not want, there was no conflict. But by the 1870s, as miners, ranchers, farmers, and railroads pushed into the West, lands once considered undesirable became the scene of violent conflict. Here's a picture looking at this. The Sioux present an obstacle to federal plans for a road to connect gold mines with southern transportation hubs. Massacre at Sand Creek. When 100,000 prospectors overran Cheyenne and Arapaho lands in Colorado in the early 1860s, federal officials tried to prevent violence by removing the Indians to a reservation before they could clash with whites. Marooned on a barren land far from the buffalo that sustained them, warriors from both tribes spent the next 3 years exacting revenge. They robbed travelers, murdered settlers, raided mail coaches, and torched camps. Colorado's territorial governor, John Evans, begged for help from the federal military, but the Union couldn't spare soldiers from the Civil War back east. Native American tradition held that warriors should not battle during the winter. So in the fall of 1864, Black Kettle, leader of the Cheyenne, guided his people to Fort Lyon in Colorado, where Governor Evans had promised they would be protected. On November 29, 1864, as Black Kettle and his followers slept along the dry bed of Sand Creek, believing they were under federal protection, a band of Colorado militiamen under Colonel John Chivington surrounded the camp. The militia charged at first light. One white witness reported, Black Kettle had a large American flag tied to the end of a long pole and stood in front of his lodging with the flag fluttering in the gray light of the winter dawn. I heard him call to the people not to be afraid, that the soldiers would not hurt them, and then the troops opened fire. The Indians raced across the creek as the soldiers pursued them, waving knives and shooting. The militiamen massacred whomever they came upon. Within hours, 200 Cheyenne Indians lay dead, most of them women and children. The surviving Cheyenne accepted assignments to a reservation. By that time, in late 1865, most of the Central Plains tribes had been confined to restricted hunting grounds, and despite treaties, whites continued to encroach upon Indian lands. Red Cloud's victory. Many Sioux Indians lived on a reservation in the Dakota Territory. In 1865, government surveyors arrived in the Dakota and Montana hunting grounds of the Sioux. The surveyors were there to plan a federal road to connect gold mines with transportation hubs to the south. Red Cloud, a Sioux chief, warned that he would resist the intrusion. When the white man comes in my country, he leaves a trail of blood behind him, Red Cloud said. I have 2 mountains in that country. I want the Great Father, the U.S. President, to make no roads through them. The government proceeded to construct 3 forts along the route. An alliance of Sioux, Arapaho, and Cheyenne responded by ransacking supply trains and picking off workers one by one. In December 1866, a party of Sioux and Cheyenne ambushed and killed 80 American soldiers, leaving their main bodies on the frozen ground. Leaders in Washington pressed for peace. In 1868, federal officials gave in to the demands of the Sioux. In a treaty signed at Fort Laramie that August, the government promised to stop construction of the road and gave the Sioux permanent use of their hunting grounds around the Black Hills in South Dakota. Red Cloud had made the United States give in to his demands, but his triumph proved short-lived. The Battle of Little Bighorn. In 1874, Colonel George Armstrong Custer led an expedition that discovered gold in the Black Hills. Within months, thousands of miners converged on the reservation. While the Army struggled to keep prospectors from trespassing on Sioux property, government officials tried to buy the land. The Sioux refused. Sitting Bull, a leader of the Lakota Sioux, said, "I want you to tell the Great Father that I do not want to sell any land to the government." He added, as he picked up a pinch of dust, "Not even this." Fed up, American soldiers allowed the miners to pour into Sioux hunting grounds, and the Army was prepared for war. The Indians did too. In the spring of 1876, more than 5,000 Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors gathered along the Little Bighorn River for their summer buffalo hunt. 600 troops under Custer were sent to track them and report their position to the commanding general. When Custer came upon the Sioux camp, he saw an opportunity for glory. Rather than alerting his superiors, he divided his men into 3 columns and attacked the next morning. Led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, the Indian warriors were ready. Within minutes, the natives surrounded Custer and his troops. Every man in Custer's column was killed, including Custer. The Sioux victory in the Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand, did not accomplish much. The Army continued to hunt the Sioux through the northern plains, preventing them from finding food. And in the fall of 1876, the Sioux leaders surrendered and gave up their lands in the Black Hills of South Dakota. The Nez Perce. The Nez Perce lived in lands that are part of present-day Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. By the 1870s, most had been forced onto reservations. In 1877, the U.S. government ordered the remaining Nez Perce to Oregon to move to a reservation in Idaho. As they made their way to Idaho, a few warriors, infuriated by their forced relocation, attacked and killed a group of white settlers. The U.S. government set the Army to retaliate. Under the attack from well-armed Army troops, a quarter of Nez Perce tried to flee to Canada. A few hundred Nez Perce repelled several American attacks over 4 months on a twisting 1,320-mile road to safety. About 40 miles from the Canadian border, the Army surrounded them. Their leader, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, known as Chief Joseph, surrendered after a 5-day siege. His people were shuttled to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma, where many died from malaria. At the time, various newspapers printed a speech that Chief Joseph was reported to have delivered upon surrendering. Because of the problems of translation and transcription, scholars debate the reliability of the printed text of Chief Joseph's speech, which supposedly included these words: "Hear me, my chiefs, I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." And there's actually a movie that was made about Chief Joseph, and they're trying to flee to Canada. I think it's called "I Will Fight No More Forever," if I remember correctly. It's an old movie. But when he gives that speech at the end, it is just really powerful. Those are some powerful words, just showing the utter resignation that they cannot possibly ever defeat the white man, that they are defeated. I will fight no more forever. Some powerful words there. The decline of the buffalo. The Plains Indians found their ways of life threatened not only by white settlement and federal troops, but also by the dwindling of the resource that had sustained them for centuries, the buffalo, the term commonly used for the American bison. The buffalo was the Plains Indians' livelihood. They ate buffalo meat, wore buffalo skins, and lived in teepees made from buffalo hide. Used the bones for tools and plates. I mean, no part of the buffalo was ever wasted. Over many years, the number of buffalo was steadily decreased, due in part to environmental factors. As more cattle, sheep, and horses came to the Great Plains, the buffalo had to compete for the limited food available on the grasslands. Cattle brought diseases that killed many buffalo. As more settlers came to the Great Plains, they changed the buffalo's habitat in ways that weakened their herds. Some historians think that overhunting by the Plain Indians themselves, especially after they acquired rifles, also furthered the decline of the buffalo population. After the Civil War, while hunters took on the major role in the buffalo's demise, in 1871 tanners discovered a way to make leather from buffalo hides. Riflemen surged onto the plains. A skilled hunter could shoot as many as 100 buffalo a day. In just 2 years, hunters killed more than 4 million of the animals. Some military officials hoped the disappearance of the buffalo would be accompanied by the decline of the people who depended on them. In 1867, one Army colonel encouraged a sport hunter to kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone. Others understood that wiping out the buffalo would make it easier to force the Plains Indians onto reservations and compel them to live as settled farmers rather than nomadic hunters. On reservations, the Plains Indians were given a few tools and some brief instruction on agricultural techniques, but many resisted the change from hunting to farming. "I will remain what I am until I die, a hunter," explained the Sioux leader Sitting Bull, "and when there are no buffalo or other game, I will send my children to hunt and live on prairie mites, for where an Indian is shut up in one place, his body becomes weak." When Indian hunters resisted the change to farming, the government tried to force them to comply. "It is indispensably necessary," a federal official wrote, "that they be placed on positions where they can be controlled and finally compelled by sheer necessity to resort to agricultural labor or starve." For people who relied on the buffalo, the threat of starvation was not an empty threat, but an imminent reality, as the creatures were hunted almost to the point of extinction. Of an estimated population of more than 30 million buffalo in 1750, by 1900, only a few hundred were left on the Great Plains. And then here's a little excerpt about how they brought back the buffalo. And if you ever have a chance, Blue Mountain State Park in western Minnesota has a herd of buffalo that they keep on the grounds. And you can see a buffalo up close there if you ever get a chance at state park. I really liked that state park when we visited there, so I'm going to put a plug in for that one. Like I said, it's out in southwestern Minnesota. In 1881, Helen Hunt Jackson, an American writer, published a book called The Century of Dishonor, in which she strongly criticized white treatment of Native Americans. The history of the government's connections with the Indians, she wrote, is a shameful record of broken treaties and unfulfilled promises. The history of the border white man's connection with the Indians is a sickening record of murder, outrage, robbery, and wrongs. Other voices joined Jackson's in calling for an end to mistreatment of American Indians. Some reformers who considered themselves friends of Native Americans argued the best way to help Indians was to Americanize them, to teach them the ways of the mainstream white culture. Many Native American children were sent to special boarding schools where they were given European names and clothes like those worn by middle-class families. At the turn of the century, reservations were home to 81 boarding schools and 147 day schools, and another 25 boarding schools, especially for Indians, were opened outside reservation land. In these schools, the children were not allowed to speak their native languages. The Secretary of the Interior asserted, if Indian children are to be civilized, they must learn the language of civilization. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, named for its sponsor, Henry L. Dawes of Massachusetts. The act allowed the president to divide every reservation into 160-acre plots. Each native family was entitled to one parcel, and each Indian who improved his property could become an American citizen. Thus, individual Indian families could own and farm their own land, just like white families. With tribal structure broken, the government believed the Indians would become peaceful citizens. After apportioning land to individual Indian families, the government also stood to profit by selling the leftover land, amounting to tens of thousands of acres on each reservation, to white settlers. Most Indians opposed the Dawes Act, but they had no say in the matter. Between 1887 and 1935, Two, the tribes lost two-thirds of their more than 130 million acres to the government. The Dawes Act mainly benefited white settlers.